Good evening. Welcome to Wednesday night worship. It's good to be here. It's good to have you here. I hope you're all still enjoying Amos, if such a thing could be said about the book of Amos. Just a reminder that last week we switched it up a little bit. We had been doing music second after the teaching part, but it seems with Amos and perhaps the prophetic books, it might be better for us to do our music first so that we are in a heart and a place to hear from God. Once we proclaim the God to whom we are listening in the books, then we are prepared to hear the texts. I think prophetic works work a little bit better that way. So it's good to have you here. We're going to be in Amos 9 tonight, but first we will have Sheldon do some music for us, and once our hearts are prepared, we will delve right back into Amos chapter 9. So good to have you here, and let's begin.
This is my prayer in the desert, when all that's within me feels dry. This is my prayer in my hunger and need. My God is the God who provides. This is my prayer in the fire, in weakness or trial or pain. There is a faith proved of more worth than gold, so refine me, Lord, through the flame. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. This is my prayer in the battle, when triumph is still on its way. I am a conqueror and co-heir with Christ, so firm on His promise I'll stand. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. All of my life, in every season, You are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. All of my life, in every season, You are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. All of my life, in every season, You are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. This is my prayer in the harvest, when favor and providence flow. I know I'm filled to be emptied again. The seed I've received I will sow. You say to us, seek my face. Our hearts reply, your face we seek. Come teach us, Lord, reveal your ways, anoint us for the greater things. We have gathered with one thirst and hunger. We're here to lift up glory, wonder, here to cry out, come and fill this place. Come and fill this place. One single wish, one sole desire, to gaze upon your beauty, God. We have gathered with one thirst, hunger. We're here to lift up glory, wonder, here to cry out, come and fill this place. Come and fill this place. We wait for you to come and show your glory here today. We wait for you to come and show your glory here today. We wait for you to come and show your glory here today. We wait for you to come and show your glory here today. We have gathered with one thirst, hunger. We're here to lift up glory, wonder, here to cry out, come and fill this place. Come and fill this place. Poverty loses its grip. Race can no longer divide. Wherever your spirit is, every darkness dies. Freedom is here with us. Burdens will fall like chains. Beauty will rise from the dust. All that's lost will be regained. You redeem, you redeem, you restore what's been stolen from me. You reclaim, you release, you rebuild with the words that you breathe. You redeem. Mercy will pour down like rain. Justice will come for the weak. Lies that were meant to defame will be crushed by the truth you speak. You redeem, you redeem, you restore what's been stolen from me. You reclaim, you release, you rebuild with the words that you happen, healing will come, the plans of our enemy ruined. Miracles will happen, healing will come, here in your presence, lost in your love. Miracles will happen, healing will come, the plans of our enemy ruined, undone. Miracles will happen, healing will come, wrecked by your presence, I'm lost in your love. You redeem, let your revival awaken me. You reclaim, you release, you rebuild what's been broken in me. You redeem, let your revival awaken me. You reclaim, you release, you rebuild what's been broken in me. You redeem.
All right, so thanks, Sheldon, for that music. And like I said before, we are now starting and finishing. Well, we're starting Amos 9, but finishing Amos tonight. So for some of you, that may be good news. For some of you, that might be sad news because it's a new book, an interesting book to study. But we're drawn to an end here, and we have gone 8 chapters now without really much hope, without much positivity. Chapter 9, at the very least, at the end of it, offers us some, just a little bit of positivity, a little bit of insight, a little bit of help for us to kind of have hope at the end of this. So we'll delve in. Hopefully, again, you've been reading along and been reading these chapters before we meet. If you haven't, again, pause the video, read chapter 9, and then rejoin the video, and we will not have gone anywhere because you paused us. So let's delve in. So chapter 9 really gets into kind of, I would say, kind of final thoughts from the prophet and from God. We have heard throughout the indictment against the people of Israel. We have heard throughout it's about injustice, it's about mistreatment of the poor, it's about abandoning God, it's about all these sorts of things. And we've heard the consequences that the prophet, that God has talked about with that. There's been visionary experiences, locusts and baskets of fruit and plumb lines, all sorts of stuff like that. But really, as we start 9, as I hope you read, you get this sort of summation, this final declaration from God. And Amos has this final vision. He says that he sees the Lord standing next to the altar. We don't know where that altar is. At this particular point in the history of Israel/Judah, there are multiple altars in multiple places. So we could be talking about the altar in Jerusalem. At the temple there, that wouldn't make much sense to the northern kingdom, who didn't worship in Jerusalem. They worshipped at Shiloh or Bethel. Or it could be at the temple in Shiloh. But the Lord is standing next to an altar, which gives the sort of this idea of the exalted one in the holy place. We shouldn't pass too quickly that Amos sees the Lord there. We aren't given a description of the Lord. Ezekiel will give us a description of what God looked like, at least kind of the surroundings of God, not really what God looked like, but the surroundings and thrones and carnelian and eyes within eyes, all sorts of stuff like that. Isaiah will describe the temple, right, being filled with the presence of God and kind of the holy temple. But Amos becomes one of the few people who records and talks about seeing with his own eyes, even in a visionary experience, Yahweh God, which is exceptional. And we ought to take note of that. It's exceptional that anyone, sees Yahweh. And so he kind of joins Isaiah, Ezekiel, John in Revelation in this kind of very singular and rare experience of being able to see God and yet live. Oops, I should have probably gone on to that first slide. So this isn't just, to see God, right? Amos sees God and hears God kind of give a decree about what's going to happen. So basically God decrees the destruction and death of the wicked within Israel. It says something, well, I'll just read it for you, 'cause it's a couple verses. Strike the capitals until the thresholds shake and shatter them down upon the heads of the people. All those who are left I will kill with a sword. Not one of them shall flee away. Not one of them shall escape. So we have a very, very, again, negative picture here that none whom sort of God has brought judgment upon will escape the judgment of God, right? We have this sort of, perhaps this vision of the people in a temple, right? The capitals and the thresholds, these grand buildings, and basically that worship that people have been offering to God in an empty way, as we've heard throughout earlier in this, that comes crashing down on their heads. And they will not escape the destruction that God has planned, has decreed upon Jerusalem. So it's like a final decree. Like God has been saying these things all along, but God's standing on the temple, and I don't know, or standing on next to the altar. It's almost as if, again, I don't know if we should read it this way, but it's an interesting thought that God is sort of standing, swearing on the altar, right? Next to this place where Yahweh is worshipped, Yahweh decrees what will be, and it is bad, it is destruction for Jerusalem. And then kind of the prophet takes up the theme as he records what God says, that the roof is coming down, right? The house is imploding upon the people of Israel, and there's not going to be anywhere for them to hide, kind of from this judgment of God, from God's wrath, from what God is doing. Though they dig into Sheol, from there my hand shall take them. Though they climb to heaven, from there I will bring them down. Though they hide themselves on top of Carmel, right? There's this idea that God says there's nowhere they can run, nowhere they can hide from this judgment that is coming, which is sort of interesting if you really think about it. We have some beautiful prose in like Psalm 139. I mean, if you're familiar with Psalm 139, like, if I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I descend to the depths of Sheol, still your hand is with me, right? The psalmist describes this just beautiful relationship where God is where people are. No matter where they are, God is there. And in the Psalms, God is there for the good. And it's almost as if God takes that psalm and flips it on its head and says, if you go to Sheol to try to escape me, I am there, and judgment will find you. If you ascend even to heaven or to Carmel, wherever, I will find you. There is nowhere to run. There is nowhere to hide that God's searching eye cannot find them. In fact, in verse 4, God says, I will fix my eyes on them for harm, not for good. If you think about the sort of hope that people have, right, that God's eyes are on Israel, it tends to be for the good, right? God is looking out for us. God is here for our good. God is watching over us. Again, we could talk Psalm 121, right? His eyes are with us. His presence are with us, right? The sun will not harm us by day, nor the moon by night. Why? Because God is with us. God's eye is upon us. God sees us in our distress. Like all of these kind of things that we read in the Psalms, we read in the Old Testament, God says, my eyes are on you, but it's not good. You cannot escape. There is a finality and a doom here that is highly disconcerting. As Amos is disconcerting. Like I've said this throughout. Like, it's just disconcerting. You read it and you're just unsettled, going, "Yeah, I don't like that." You're not supposed to. We're not supposed to. This is judgment upon the people of Israel. And then, sort of to cap it all off, the Lord talks about the kind of the sovereign power, right? Reminding the people of God's unmatched power, right? Both to create and to destroy. In this particular instance, it's to destroy, right? God's unmatched power is an implement of destruction upon the people in this particular case. Again, not a great thing, but God is powerful. And basically it says the one who creates, the one who destroys, Yahweh, the Lord, is his name. Again, establishing that Yahweh is not just a God of love and of election, but that God also is the God who holds the people account, the one who creates also destroys, for the good of, I would say, the good of creation, for the good of the world, for the good of the oppressed. And it's gloomy and bad and hard and a difficult place to be, but this is the Lord, is what's going on here.
I think, well, God is complex. There's a lot of characteristics and things that we cannot wrap our heads around, and maybe never will. So in these kind of passages that kind of point to God, a specific thing about God. So in this sense, it's talking about God's judgment, and it's this great account of God's judgment. I find myself looking for, what else does this reveal about God? And so I guess my question for reflection, for discussion, is in this judgment account, what other characteristics are revealed about God through it?
That's a really good question, because we tend to think about God as sort of one-dimensional in the ways that we need God to be at any given moment. And I think, reading the Psalms is particularly helpful here. Reading this is helpful because God generally explains why God is doing stuff, right? I'm doing this not because I'm supremely angry, but because of the fact that they have been perpetuating injustice, right? If God knows absolutely, if God is always where we try to hide from God, right? So that God searches, right? The God who finds the lost sheep is the same God who will find us when we're hiding because we've done something wrong or we're trying to escape, right? The God who seeks and saves the lost is the God who finds Adam and Eve in the garden when they're hiding. So we have to read sort of both sides. We can't have the vindicate me from my enemies of the Psalms without a God who vindicates the right, the oppressed from those who oppress, right? So vindication looks awfully different depending on which side of that you're looking at. Israel had in their history talked about vindication, needing to be vindicated, because they were throughout most of their history weak, right? They were not the strong ones in the neighborhood. And so they needed help, right? They needed help to be delivered from Egypt. They needed help to be delivered from the Philistines. All this stuff. They needed to be vindicated because other people were picking on him. But what we have in Amos is when things get reversed and it's Israel doing the picking. It's Israel in the positions of power. And now the vindication of the weak looks a lot different because the weak are not the people of Israel at this point, or at least not the ones to whom this is addressed. And so I think, for us, the church, we have to be very, very careful crying oppression or crying vindication from our enemies. Because, quite frankly, the church is not, at least in the West, oppressed. We are not, largely speaking, the victims of injustice, right? The fact that churches got closed down in the pandemic, and you may disagree with me on this, was not oppression of the church. It was asking the church to do what every other gathering place was asked to do, and that is not operate in these times. Now, whatever responses we had to that, we could sift through that, but when we are in positions of power and influence, when we are, again, largely speaking, as Westerners, as Americans, rich compared to the rest of the globe, we must be very careful assuming which side of God's vindication we're on. So sometimes what feels like, God, it's not fair, is actually God saying, well, perhaps you're on the wrong side of my vindication. Perhaps I'm standing up for the weak and you are not it in this instance. So we need to just be careful to say God applies these things evenly. If the oppressed become oppressor, God will apply the same things to the oppressor, and God will act on the behalf of the weak. And so we just have to be very, very careful to understand which side we're on. I don't know if that really answers your question, but this reveals that God is just, right? Just as Israel cried out in the past to be rescued, to be saved, and God acted mightily on their behalf, that was bad for Egypt when the people came out of Egypt. So now the people of Israel find themselves in the position of Egypt. And it's bad for them. Because God is a God of justice. And again, whether that's good news, it really depends on which side of the power vacuum you're on. Which is why Christ asks us to exercise power in very, very different ways than the world around us. I could go on, but I won't. So moving on to kind of the second bit here. This perhaps for me is the most telling and the most fascinating portion of Amos, and one of the more fascinating portions of Scripture, really. Because what happens in this first kind of part of this section is basically to tell Israel that though they might be elect, God has dealings with other people, and that they are, in this respect, no different. Like that they are not more loved, more respected, more helped than any other people. So if you read kind of that 7 and 8, just listen to this real quick. I think it bears reading. Are you not like the Ethiopians to me? Well, the first response to that by the people would be, no, we're Israel. We're the people of God. Did I not bring Israel from the land of Egypt? And the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Kir. The eyes of the Lord are upon this sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth, except that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, says the Lord. So it's brief and it's not super clear, but we have here that God has dealings with other people in very similar ways, right? Comparing bringing the people of Israel out of Egypt to bringing the Philistines out from Caphtor and the Arameans from Kir. Philistines and Arameans were traditional enemies of Israel, and yet God is saying, I have delivered them in similar ways that I have delivered you. It reminds me in the Gospel of John, Jesus says to his disciples, I have other sheep that you don't know about. Which is kind of out of the blue, and he doesn't explain it at all. But wait, if it's not just Israel, wait, there are other sheep? That God has dealings with other people besides us. God has relationships with other people besides the church. And when we just think that God acts only on our behalf, we find ourselves in danger. That God has dealings with other people. That in that respect, we're special. And I know that's hard to hear sometimes, but that God loves us no less and acts for our vindication no less than other people, than the Philistines or the Arameans, who again were traditional. But what happened to the Philistines? They might have been delivered, but they became oppressors of Israel, and God judged them. Aram, the same thing, right? They might have been delivered, but then they became powerful and oppressed others, and God dealt with that. And so God is saying, I brought them up and I dealt with them when they were wicked. And I brought this people up and I dealt with them when they were wicked. I brought you out of Egypt, but that doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. I will deal with the sinful kingdom. The eyes of the Lord, again, that idea, I'm watching you like I see you, are on the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth. He basically says the only thing unique about Israel is I'm just not going to destroy you completely. There'll be a remnant. And that's not much hope in this particular thing. And then basically God then says, then lo, I will command, I will shake the house of Israel among the nation as one shakes with a sieve. But no pebble shall fall to the ground. All sinners of my people shall die by the sword. Listen to that. All sinners of my people shall die by the sword, who say, evil shall not meet or overtake us. Now, the short version that I read here is this is parabolic, this is really crazy, this is hyper language. But basically what God's saying is, you cannot trust to your election relationship with me, for I deal with you as I deal with all nations when they turn sinful. So if the people cannot hope or trust in election, perhaps they can hope for luck, that they will somehow escape, right? That they will be a pebble that falls out of the sieve and back into the flour, so to speak. And God says, not a single pebble shall escape. I read this, there's other ways of reading it, but I read this as the pebbles being the sinful, thinking they can just sort of jump out of the sieve and get mixed back in with the flour. The whole point of the sieve is you sift it, the good stuff goes through, and the junk remains inside. At least the flour sieve, that's how it works. So it's almost as if God's saying, nothing's going to escape. The sinful will not escape. They cannot even hope for luck in this. That if God's eyes are on the wicked will be held to account.
This idea of sifting through is, I think it's an interesting metaphor to look at as not, again, in terms of God, it's not just a destroying and starting fresh. It's not going out and getting more flour. It's sifting through for the purpose of purification. And every time I read through Scripture and I read these passages of how the people of God are behaving and interacting with one another as not the people of God, it's just always so incredible that time and time and time and time again, God seeks to restore rather than to destroy. And even when destruction does come, there is still the remnant that is left over. And so this definitely has an easy answer to this question, a very Sunday school answer to this question. But maybe for those of you watching this, maybe I challenge you to think a little bit deeper about this and dwell on it a little bit more as you reflect and discuss. But why, I guess? Why does God, time and time again, seek to restore his creation rather than to destroy?
The short Sunday school answer is love, right? And, sort of common parlance, if you're thinking about, I don't know, I do woodworking. There's a point sometimes at which I've made something and I realize it just has to be, I can't save it. Working, particularly for me, working with doors and drawers, there's a point at which the door is so out of true or out of square and warped that I can't save it. And so I literally have to scrap it, which is very, very difficult for me because I've poured lots of time into those rabbits, into cutting it right, into making sure it fits and all that stuff, and it's hard. But Carmen Parlance says if you can't beat something right, if you can't make it right, you got to start over again. And I think God doesn't operate in that realm. Almost, I won't say foolishly. It seems, I think, foolish sometimes. That God's love is so searching that God just says, I'm not willing to abandon any of this. I'm willing to abandon this creation, right? The sort of theme of Revelation is God's not willing to abandon creation totally. At the end, I am making all things new. Not, I am making all new things. God doesn't recreate everything. God takes the remnant, and forms something, a peaceful kingdom, the eternal kingdom, whatever you want to call it. I think there's that, and I think the remnant for Israel also is sort of an honor of those that, yet there are some who haven't turned away. It's 1 Kings, right, when Elijah basically says, God, I'm done, there's nobody left. I alone am left. I'm the only one faithful, right? Which is a pretty gutsy statement to make, but he felt that way, right? Sometimes it feels that way. And God says, no, there's some. who have persevered. There's some who have not bowed their knees to the Baals or followed after Jezebel, right? There are some. There's a remnant. There's always this remnant. And I think perhaps this is part of God's way of honoring the suffering of the remnant, those who were faithful, those who were persecuted for righteousness' sake, right? All of that, I think this idea of God says, I will take them and I will make something, I don't know, better, but more faithful. I will take the faithful and they will be faithful. Rather than just sort of utterly destroying it. And maybe that's part of the message of God bargaining with Abraham, right? Will you spare it for 10 righteous? Will you spare it for 5? Right? It's Abraham going, God, are you going to honor those who were faithful? Right? And the less people who are faithful, the greater the risk, right? Because there's strength in numbers. And so I wonder if that's it. I think it's for love of God's creation. It's love of God's people. It's for love of God's promise. Fidelity to God's own nature. I think sometimes that would cause that. But for me, it all boils down to love. God is not willing to abandon creation to chaos and decay. And that's sort of the message of the cross. That's the message here, that there are times where God says, I cannot abandon it utterly, so I must step in and make things right. And God does that by preserving a remnant who remembers what God has done. Right? The remnant of Israel who comes back from exile remembers what God has done, because nobody's ever done that before. Nobody's come back from exile. That's unheard of. And therefore they are able to sort of, in the words of the Hebrews, or Paul, to live to the praise of his glory. Right? God did it. Or, in other language, then they will know that Yahweh is God. All right. And now, the final slide of Amos. You can all breathe a sigh of relief and some good news. So basically, we end Amos with these kind of 2 oracles, these 2 promises of restoration and hope. Now, before we get too excited, it should be also noted, and sorry for the passive voice there, but we should note that that it's likely that this wasn't written at the time of Amos. We've talked about sort of the editing history of this, because Amos doesn't really talk about return from exile very much. But here we hit it. So whether it's originally a part or it has become a part by later editors, I think it's important to note that they found this to be a theme worth including. Perhaps what we have here is hindsight. And hindsight being 2020, perhaps that's a good thing for us in posterity. But we have these messages of hope, specifically two messages of hope, 2 oracles that have promise. The first one is a promise that basically God will again raise the house, the tent, the booth of David, which is interesting. And the mention of David is one of the reasons we're not so sure about the dating on this, because the people in the northern kingdom would not look at David as sort of the height of rule, because they separated not long after David, right? So he wouldn't be their sort of paragon, their exemplar of rule. Now, that being said, what David represents scripturally and broadly in the future generations is what Israel was like when it was run well, what justice looked like, what a compassionate king looked like, what a king who submitted himself to God even when he was wrong, right? When he took rebuke and didn't just ignore it, but rather submitted to it. He's sort of this is what righteous kingdoms look like. And so it's a promise that God will not only restore the kingdom, but will restore it in righteousness and in goodness. Now we can take that also in a sort of a precursor echoes of Jesus in there, right? The one from the branch of Jesse who rules well, right? Who rules in absolute righteousness. But there is hope here. This idea of the Davidic kingdom, the kingdom that God had established through David's line, has collapsed, right? Northern and southern kingdom ultimately has collapsed. And so this is sort of a promise that God will rebuild it, will rebuild this house for David, return the people to right rule. We have that there. One of the notes that I think is important to make in all of this is just because God will set things right does not absolve us of the responsibility to do things right now. So I hope that makes sense. A lot of the prophets is God will make it right, God will make it right, God will make it right. But a lot of bad stuff happens in the meantime. Wouldn't it be better if we made it right now? Meaning we did what God asked now rather than having God have to judge us for it. And so there's a responsibility that we have in reading the prophets as those who come behind. It's not this sort of future hope. I think sometimes that's what we read Revelations like, okay, if we can just kind of, things are going horrible around us and they're going to continue to do so, and we just kind of have to sit back until God makes things right. No, God, especially in Christ, establishes justice now and shows us how to live now, and we are called and have held responsible to do it now, even if we are resisted by the powers that be around us. We are called to enact the loving justice kingdom of God now in any ways that we can, right? We may not be people of power, but we can enact love, kindness, justice all around us. We are called to do it now. God will make it ultimately right, but we must follow. That's what the faithful remnant has done. Is when everyone else around them is doing something different for expedience or greed's sake, whatever, the remnant says, no, we won't bow to that. We won't bow to popular opinion or power or division, whatever it might be. Right? Sorry, that was a rabbit trail, but I think it needed to be said. So that's the first vision, is kind of the restoration of the kingdom, sort of the right Davidic kingdom. And then the next is this vision of a land of plenty. So if you remember, not just here in Amos, but elsewhere in the prophets, right? A lot of times what we have is the people suffer because the land is suffering, or in Joel, as we read in our last study, that the land is literally rejecting the people, refusing to give grain. Or in Amos, right, there's drought, there's locusts, right, there's just desolation on the creation itself. So we're left with this sort of just ruined kind of vision of a ruined plain, right? There's nothing growing, there's drought, there is everything's eaten by locusts, there is nothing producing fruit, there's no wine, there's no grapes, there's no water flowing, there is desert, parched, dry, right? That's kind of the vision the prophets leave us with of the land, because the land suffers for the sin of the people. That'll come up in Isaiah as God basically says, I'm sending you into exile so that my land can have its rest, can have its Sabbaths, can be restored. But the land itself rejects the people and becomes an instrument of God's judgment on people. And so the sort of the hope, the return, is a land that is fruitful, that is growing. In fact, the way Amos describes it is that just as the people are kind of, the people who are sowing wheat are so busy, or who are reaping the wheat, who are bringing it in, right, bringing in the foodstuffs, are so busy, and it takes so long that they end up running into the people who are sowing the next crop, right? So it's just kind of this cycle of there's so much, there's abundance, so that the people picking the grapes are running into the people planting the next crop of grapes, right? This idea of plenty, of abundance, of fruitfulness, and that's a common theme throughout the prophets of the world made right, right? The world made wrong is barrenness, is drought, is famine, right? All this stuff, whereas the vision of God's kingdom, the vision of the world made right, is abundance. Ezekiel mentions that there's a river that flows from the temple of God, and it goes through the wilderness, and on either side there are trees that bear fruit in season and out of season, right? It gives life to the nations, right? This bountiful, this plentiful, this fruitful land. In Revelation, the same thing. We have the vision of the river that flows from beneath the throne of God and gives life to the nations, and on each side there is fruit for the healing of the nations, right? It's interesting, whenever the kingdom is mentioned, whenever these visions of the kingdom, in most, in fact, of the prophetic books, it has as a part this fruitfulness of the land itself, right? That is a vision of the kingdom restored, right? So again, we don't just have, it's not just people-centric, but rather there is land that enjoys, that when the people of God are acting as they should, and being what we ought to be, when God's rule is established as it should be, creation itself flourishes. Not just humanity, but creation itself, right? we have a very myopic vision of the world if we think it's only about humans, that God created all of this stuff before God created humanity. And this was going, and it was good, and then God put humanity in it and said, make sure it stays good, tend it. You have dominion over the garden. But we have ruined that, right? We see it in Amos, we see it all around, right? What once was flourishing is now in decay. And so creation itself longs for the revelation of the children of God. And so we get to our end there that there's a part that nature plays in, that part of God's redeeming work extends beyond people to nature itself, that when people flourish in righteousness, nature flourishes as well. There is a balance, a responsibility of the people of God to nature as well, to creation itself, to the land, to the animals, all sorts of things like that. So you may call me green, whatever you want, but Scripture is filled with this stuff of humanity, and part of restored relationship is this relationship with creation itself. And so in the end of Amos, and I'll end on this, we have this vision of God making things new, of not only humanity flourishing, the people of God flourishing, but creation itself flourishing. And again, fast forward to the way end, right? Revelation 21, that's the same vision we have. Creation itself flourishing as humanity flourishes within it, because why? Every knee is bowing to the one to whom we ultimately owe allegiance, and that is God. Singing around the throne of the Lamb. Sheldon.
So when we read this book of Amos, and we read these 9 chapters that are really distressing, disturbing, very depressing, and we get to the end of it and we see this little bit of hope and restoration. I guess what do we make of this? Is this all just a warning? Is it something that we read and we think, oh, I don't want to end up like Israel, and so I'm going to do this, that, or the other? Is that how we are supposed to read it? Is that what we're supposed to get from it? Or is there more?
Short answer is there's always more, Sheldon. But certainly, I think we have a lot we discover. We discover about God, right? God's intense commitment to justice, and God's intense commitment to seeing God's people be a people of justice. So we see that about God. We see the side of God, that on the other side of God's love and care for the poor, for the marginalized, is the fact that God stands up for them. And if we are on the giving end of injustice, of exploiting the poor and the marginalized, then we will find God standing up against us. So there is warning there not to go down that road. But also this idea of, sort of in the negative example we have here, we have the positive example of how we should be. Right? We have these glimpses into what God's doing with other people. Wait, God did an exodus for the Philistines? What? I don't see that anywhere. That's because, well, we aren't Philistines, right? So we see that. I think it shows in us the commitment we are to have as the people of God to justice, to the poor, to the marginalized, wherever they may be, and shows us that in our own worship, we are to make sure that in our own worship, we are not praising a God and yet doing the very things God despises when we leave, right? We hear that sort of talk of, you're worshiping me, and all the while on your Sabbath day, you're thinking about how to take advantage of the poor the next day. I very much doubt people are going, I wonder how I can take advantage of the poor, but how can I squeeze a little bit more out of this person? What's the highest price I can charge for that? Economics says that, right, you can charge whatever the market will bear. That might be economics, but, right, especially when we're talking about things that people need, is that a good course of action? Am I making the most money? But what side of God does that find us on? How are we going about our business practices? How are we going about our buying practices, right? I don't want to pick on Walmart. They employ lots of people, but, right, saving 50 cents on that item, right, if that is not sourced well or the people aren't paid well enough to have a living wage, is it worth it for me to save that money in order for other people, and now that other people are being exploited? For some of us, that's not an option. We have to buy the cheapest thing. Right? We don't have the money. For others of us, we have choices we can make as to where we give our money. Right? This company pays $15 an hour. I pay more for my bottle of water. But this company pays a living wage. And if I can afford this, then maybe I ought to think about that rather than making sure I get the best deal, right? So I think it helps us think about these things in different ways, but it also helps us to see that faith is not about what we do in a church on Sunday morning or whatever day you happen to be here in worship. That our worship of God is not limited to that. Our worship of God is what happens when we leave. And for this to mean anything in here, it has to be in some ways, and we will do it imperfectly, enacted out there. We have to be the people of God out there. Otherwise, what we do in here is useless, is empty. One of my largest fears as a leader of a church, as a pastor, as one who helps lead worship, right, is the thought that God might say, I hate your worship. I hate your songs. They're noise in my ear. Because you sing these things to me and then you go out and do the very opposite the next day. That scares me, to think that I participate or that I will ever participate in worship that just gives lip service and doesn't change the way I act outside. For me personally, but also as a leader for what I am saying and teaching. Scares is the wrong word, but it keeps me on the edge of my seat. It makes me want to make sure that what we are doing is not simply giving lip service to a worship of God, hoping that somehow, because we've done the right things on a Sunday morning, God will bless us. Rather, we are here because God has already blessed us, right, with salvation, with life, with freedom from sin. And we take that blessing and use it, so to speak, to bless those around us. I am no longer bound by sin to serve my own needs all the time. And so I can go out of here and I can serve the needs of others. I can choose that. Right? I am free to choose either, perhaps for the first time, which am I going to choose? For more on that, you can go to last week's sermon on Sunday morning. But with that, thus concludes the book of Amos. And I think if I would conclude and wrap up in any sort of way, it would be, this is hard teaching. But my prayer is that we would take it, that I would take it, that corporately we would take it, we would hear it and ask God, how do we enact your justice in the world around us as the people of God? Thanks for joining us. Tune in next week. We're starting Obadiah. Have a good night, and we'll see you.